the next two sessions will be about SORA. As mentioned earlier by the CAA team, the UK will in due course adopt SORA. And I don't know if any of you have already read in the past SORA 2.0, or if you have started to read as well SORA 2.5. On my end, I find that it's a very powerful tool, but at the same time, it's also a very complex tool. And so it will help us do a lot of things in terms of risk assessment and risk management. But I think it will also be a tool that we need to adopt gradually and understand over time. So the two sessions on SORA that we are going to have now are a feedback from Consortiq, and then we will have as well the feedback from Airborne Robotics, who is in our room. So Andy and Chris of Consortiq have had past experience in terms of actually going through the SORA application process on the continent, and they wanted to share that feedback with us. Now, today they are on the job. One is in Wales, and I think Chris is in Portugal. So what we did is that we had our discussion yesterday, we recorded. They were kind enough to do it from their hotel room, so you will excuse the background. We've edited that video so that we can share the best of their thoughts. And I have to say, as a warning, this is not everything that Consortiq would have to say about SORA, and I think we could expand on SORA for hours and hours. And I was cheeky enough to pick some of those conversations that we had yesterday, and we're sharing them with you today.
I'm the training manager and chief pilot for Europe, Middle East and Africa for Consortiq, which is a global drone company and also an RAE within the UK. Chris?
Yes, thanks, Annalise. So apologies as well, I was unable to attend today, but I'm effectively an independent drone consultant, but I work very closely and heavily with Andy and Consortiq on their consultancy work, risk assessments, and I'm also their accountable manager for the RA operations.
Great, thank you. So maybe we will start with the basics. Andy, can you let us know what is SORA?
SORA, yeah, it's an acronym that gets bandied around all over the place, but there's probably a handful of people that actually fully understand it. It was is a process that was developed by JARAS and is a very methodical approach to analysing the risks involved in a drone operation. It's actually a 10-step process that you go through that starts off describing the concept of the operations that you want to do and goes on through the ground risk and evaluation of the air risk. But actually, the process itself is just a methodical series of steps that you go through. But in order to understand it more than that, I think, Chris, I think we decided you just run through one that you did. And
I've got the short straw. So as Andy said, it is technically a 10-step process, but I challenge anyone to recall all those 10 steps. So what I thought I'd do, I'd just go through the kind of key stages to give you an idea of the fundamentals, really. So as Andy mentioned, if you're familiar with the UK OSC process, which is what we're really comparing it to, the first step is your concept of operations. So that really remains the same as we know now, which is your volume 1 and volume 2 of your operations manual. And then the SORA application is essentially your volume 3. So you're replacing your UK OSC with this SORA volume 3, if you like. So that's the first step. And you're going to start the SORA by looking at your operating envelope, your intentional operating envelope, and assessing both the ground risk and the air risk that's posed to third parties. So if we think about the air risk, the big difference with SORA that becomes apparent straight away, it's a much more quantitative and mathematical approach, whereas in the UK, it's really up to currently under the OSC process, is up to the operator to define the risks, and that's very much based on a feeling of how risky you think it is. And then the mitigations, again, are down to you to decide, and the CA to agree whether it's sufficient without very much being laid down in advance. So the first big difference with your SORA ground risk process is you essentially enter a table, you work out the kinetic energy of any potential impact from your UAS, and then you combine that kinetic energy with a particular operational scenario. So that will consider if it's in a populated area, if it's over a gathering of people, if it's BV loss or BV loss, and you combine that operational area with the kinetic energy of an impact, and that will determine your initial UAS ground risk. So, and that will have a mathematical output achievable. I think the disadvantage, perhaps with the SORA for perhaps the sole trader or the smaller drone operator, is it's very much a heavy-handed instrument. It's a lot of work to achieve something that might be relatively small. I was talking with Andy earlier, and we were discussing, if you wanted to just fly, say, above 400 feet in the UK, which would be considered a relatively straightforward OSC application with some simple mitigations, the SORA doesn't really allow for that specific scenario, and it doesn't actually suggest mitigations for that specific scenario. That they don't exist within the SORA, so that then becomes slightly challenging to write within the current SORA framework. Equally, some areas are overly mathematical, so they talk in some cases about reducing the probability of your drone leaving your operational volume being less than a certain number, 10 to the minus 4 flying hours. But again, as a small operator, or even as a community, we don't have that data to know, necessarily how many flying hours for a particular UAS across the whole community would perhaps have a failure that might result in it leaving its flying area. So how do we demonstrate that to the authority without that data? There are problems there.
I think it would be fair to say that SORA is a very, very effective tool for complex operations. But you need to have a good deal of information to fill in the blanks. And the one that springs to mind for me is it talks a lot about population density, which is not necessarily information that an average person has got to hand. Same as the flying hours and the probability of a failure within given flying hours. If you're conducting a large-scale complex operation, maybe BV loss over many miles, these are the kind of bits of information that you may have at your fingertips. If you're an operator that wants to work in the centre of London but with reduced separations, it's not going to be so easy to lay your hands on all of that detail. And I think Chris and I have discussed this a few times, and probably the way forward would be for greater use of PDRAs rather than the SORA being the go-to tool for the not so complex operations, but more complex than the basic.
Yeah, I think the other challenge is some of the mitigations, and I talked about the integrity levels being low, medium, or high. If you end up in a scenario where you need high integrity levels, you often need an authority to verify, a third party to verify that you have either the technical capability, the operational ability, or an audit to say you are sufficiently capable of conducting that operation. And the question remains, well, who is that authority? Who can technically assess in the UK a particular drone to say this meets that level of assurance? That doesn't exist currently. But I think the top tip I would have for a small operation, and the way we've approached our applications in Europe, is to work back to front. Because often if you're not careful, you end up in a scenario where you need very, very high levels of mitigation to reduce the risk. So rather than working through the process in the order it suggests, I would often recommend going to the end effectively and saying, well, what level of integrity, what cell number do I need? Because if you can get your cell number down to 1, 2, or 3, then the mitigations become more straightforward and you're avoiding the very complicated or very costly mitigations. So if you can go to that end stage and work backwards, it makes the application more achievable.
Yeah, okay. So maybe one way forward is to suggest the development of some new PDRAs in the cell 1, 2, 3 area, so that, when we implement SORA eventually, it is not an administrative burden to grow the industry. And when we introduce it, we have tools available from day one that would be, helpful for the majority of the market in the end.
I think for most of the instances where you're saying 1 or 2, there probably could be a PDRA. Once you start getting 3 and above, that's when you start getting into design verification reports and things like that maybe aren't quite in place, or would be a complex situation to be in for a sole trader or small operator.
Yeah, I think Andy's right. I think we the industry has been around for a fairly long time now, and we know what the common requirements are at sort of basic OSC level that people want to do on a fairly routine basis. So that's what SORA is not really there, in my view, for those kind of operations, particularly when the risk level is very low.
Yeah.
This is more for bespoke or highly technical or highly risky operations.
Okay, understood. Well, you've enlightened me in a way, so thank you both for having this conversation. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video. And again, I would like to thank Andy and Chris who did it while on the job. And I thought it was very useful to have their honest and transparent and sincere feedback. We can talk about the SORA methodology for hours and hours, and they certainly can. So this is just a glimpse of their approach to it.